Hello everyone. Thank you guys for attending our last lecture series with our last lecture with Professor Bowie. And so before we get started, I just have a few opening remarks for everyone. So good afternoon. My name is Travis. I am one of your class marshals. And on behalf of the class marshals, I'm very thankful and very grateful to be here to welcome you all to our last lecture. The last lecture series provides an opportunity for faculty members selected by us to provide guidance and impart final words of wisdom to the graduating class. We kicked off this series earlier this month, and we've had lectures from Professor Jenkins, Professor Block, and earlier this week from Professor Bavitz. And so now, before we start, I just want to remind everyone this lecture will be recorded, and there's food in the back, so if you haven't already grabbed, this is your last chance to. Now today, I have the distinct honor of introducing Professor Niko Bowie to everyone. Professor Bowie received his bachelor's degree in history from Yale University and received both his JD and PhD from Harvard. He's clerked for Judge Sutton of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and Judge Sonia Sotomayor of the U.S. Supreme Court. At HLS, he is the Louis D. Brandeis Professor of Law, and in addition to his teaching and writing, Professor Bowie is also a very active member in local government and in the civil rights community within law school. He is an historian who teaches courses in federal constitutional law, state constitutional law, and local government. His research interests focus on critical legal histories of democracy in the United States. And when he's not in the classroom being an academic, you can find him on the boards of the ACLU Massachusetts, Lawyers for Civil Rights, Mass Vote, People's Parity Project, and he's also an avid marathoner. We are very grateful that Professor Bowie chose to be a part of our last lecture series. And just to, in addition, he previously has been awarded by the students the 2021 Sachs Freed Award for Teaching Excellence from the previous graduating class. So can you please join me in one last round of applause for Professor Bowie.
Thank you so much, Travis, and thank you to the class marshals for inviting me to speak to all of you. It's such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in this room. I'm sure you can all understand how isolating this law school can be. But when I see you here, when I see you in the hallway, when I see you in my classroom, I feel part of the community, and that's really important to me. And it's going to be the theme I want to talk to you about. And I already know this is going to be a little emotional, so bear with me as I try to make it through the end of this lecture. So your class is special. You're a unique class. You're the first post-COVID class, or the class to arrive back on campus after the pandemic. And so that meant you had some unique obstacles that previous generations of millennials never experienced, from going to class with people wearing masks, to experiencing locked doors that prevent people from entering and exiting the law school without an ID, to the general sense that social distancing is the norm, that expectation is to keep one another safe. We have to maintain our 6 feet of separation. Most importantly, the pandemic not only wrecked lives, but it also wrecked the institutional memory of this place. So the student leaders who would have been 2Ls and 3Ls when you arrived and familiar with how this place works and what all of the organizations do and are supposed to do, all of them were learning at the same time as you as to how to get things off the ground. So you were not only the first sort of guinea pig class for can we safely teach at this law school, but you were also responsible for determining what the culture of each of your organizations would look like. And so now 3 years later, or 2 years later that you're graduating should be a moment to celebrate the kinds of accomplishments your organizations with their new cultures that you have created have accomplished. For example, your class is responsible for raising the floor of LIP to $70,000, making it far more likely that future generations can afford to do public interest work, the kind of work that they came to law school to do after graduating. This should be the kind of thing that you're celebrating right now. It should be, congratulations. And so, of course, if I wanted to go to your student organization websites and look to see, who should I be congratulating for all of the coalition building and work that went into doing something so important and transformative for the law school, if I went to the WLA website or to the ACS website, the PPP website, and asked, who are the leaders of these organizations? I would find a lot of 404 pages. It's actually pretty difficult right now to figure out who runs this school, because all of the membership of all of the organizations are hidden. And I think we all know the reason for that. We know it because when the organization's membership was public, we saw faces not just on websites, but on a truck that drove around Harvard Yard accusing people of being Harvard's leading anti-Semites. We saw people getting death threats on social media. We saw members of Congress reach out and accuse people by name of being anti-Semitic because of their advocacy on behalf of the liberation of Palestinians. We've seen students get personally targeted at their homes. Students feel unsafe to walk around and go to and from class. And students terrified of being in the crosshairs, not just at this school, but in the national and international media. Given this kind of campaign against you and your class, it is not at all surprising to me why it is so difficult to figure out who is in a student organization. I would be terrified of revealing my identity too, if simply being a member of the Muslim Law Student Association meant I could find my face on a truck. But what is surprising to me, and what I want to make the focus of the rest of this lecture, is something else I saw in the last 6 months from your class. I saw solidarity. I saw within a week of these sorts of campaigns against individual students, student organizations rally around yourselves and your classmates and say that threats against individual students are unacceptable. I saw you be able to hold two things at once, that the murder of people abroad is wrong, and so is the intimidation of your classmates. That dispossession is wrong, and so is intimidation at home. It is possible to be an ethical person, and being an ethical person does not require persecuting the people around you. And I saw that you took this action when the law school would not. The Harvard Law community statement that declared this campaign against your classmates was made by you, not by the formal leadership of our institution. That surprised me. I wouldn't have predicted that. But it also inspired me. It made me proud to know you, and to have taught you, and to be taught by you. Because standing up for other people when they are facing persecution is hard. It is hard when the stakes are high, and it is hard when the stakes are low. In my own experience, I have a story from when I was in high school in an AP US history class that the stakes could not have been lower. And we were talking about the progressive income tax. Until 2022, Massachusetts did not have a progressive income tax. The state thought that it was unconstitutional under the state constitution, and we were talking about it in class. And the question that my teacher, Ms. Siriani, presented to us is, what do you think about taxing wealthy people at a higher rate than poor people? And so this is a high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I thought the answer is pretty obvious, like awesome, soak the rich. And the first person who spoke among my classmates, a woman named Stephanie, agreed. So she said, it seems pretty intuitive that if you are making a lot more money and you're taxed at a higher rate, that inflicts sort of like less damage on your ability to feed yourselves and your family. It seems fine to tax wealthy people at a higher rate than poor people. But the next few people in the class who spoke surprised me by saying that's really unfair. That if you tax people at a set rate, like 5%, like Massachusetts does, wealthy people will inevitably pay more than poor people because 5% of a lot is more than 5% of a little. So to raise the rate, it's really unfair. It's treating the people differently, and that's wrong. And so one person after another just started talking about how bad the progressive income tax was. And to me, this was like really odd. Like I couldn't imagine why my classmates in Cambridge would think this way. But I did not say anything because I did not want to be in Stephanie's position of having been gone first, only to have everyone disagree with her. And so at the end of the class, Ms. Sirianni asked me to stop by the door and hang out for a few minutes before going to my next class. And she was one of the few teachers I'd ever had who called everybody by their last name. She was like, Mr. Bowie, what do you think about progressive income? I know you. I think you'd like it. And I was like, sure do. And she said, well, why didn't you say anything during the class when Stephanie had raised her hand to talk about it? And I said, well, she seemed to be doing a pretty good job on her own. She wasn't asking for my support. It wasn't like she was, visibly nervous about being attacked. But Ms. Sirianni asked me, well, but how do you think she felt being the only person to stand for this position, and you agreed with her but didn't say anything? I said, oh, that's kind of deep. I guess she must feel a little lonely. Ms. Sirianni said, I think she probably did, and I hope that the next time something like this happens, you remember this conversation. And I never forgot it. I wasn't under any threat at all in high school. No one was going to come after me for arguing on behalf of a progressive income tax. But I think one of my assumptions in high school was, I'm young, I don't know anything. As I get older and I get more power and more responsibility, it will be easier to stand up on behalf of others. But I found that sense of vulnerability, of being unafraid to take risks, just never really goes away. When I was in college, I was afraid of discipline or being unliked by some of my classmates. In law school, I was afraid of not being able to get a clerkship or having a professor write a bad letter of recommendation. As an assistant professor, someone without tenure, I was afraid that my peers would see something I did and say something during the tenure meeting that would cost me my job. Even as someone who has tenure, and probably not going to get fired. It's still terrifying to be the only person in the room saying something that may seem really intuitive, really obvious, but that, for whatever reason, is not being said by others. The sense of social isolation is real, and simply accumulating power does not come with a set of instructions on how to use that power responsibly. Climbing a ladder of power takes a lot of work, and sometimes principles can weigh you down. It may be helpful to put them on the ground for a second as you keep climbing. But one cost of that metaphor is as you climb higher and higher, they get a little bit further away. And so it wasn't simply getting a job here or having this position that made it easier for me or people like me to stand up for something that's meaningful. But there is a lot of research about what does inspire people to stand up for others. And that's relationships. So there's lots and lots and lots of research about what is it that persuades people to join others in pursuit of change, even in the face of threats, even when it's hard, even when you're better off sitting on your couch hoping that someone else will do the hard work for you. And it's the same thing that builds the labor movement, that leads to strikes, that leads to successful campaigns for justice. It's relationships with other people. To use the language of Jane McAlevey, there are no shortcuts to building power other than just meeting and talking and getting to know someone else and relating what your shared values are and how you two can join together to exercise them together. And it's relationships that are what drive people from the couch, drive people from silence to speak out. In his book, Freedom Summer, Doug McAdams talks about the college students during 1964 when they were invited from the North to go to Mississippi to help Black people there register to vote in the year before the Voting Rights Act was passed. About 1,000 students. And as they were assembling to go down to Mississippi in June, 3 of their peers were murdered by white supremacists in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So you can imagine, you're not too far away from being college students, how you would feel going to a place like Mississippi where you might get murdered for helping people register to vote. And so McAdams talks about what is the difference between the people who dropped out of the Freedom Summer versus the people who said, nevertheless, I'm going to go to Mississippi. And the answer is not that one group was more committed to the other than the other. It wasn't that one group was more knowledgeable or one group simply had more of what it takes, more courage. It was that one group simply knew more people who were going to Mississippi. Their friends were going to Mississippi. They did not want to be the one person in their group who stayed behind. As Malcolm Gladwell describes his analysis of the book, there's this pattern, called a pattern involving critical friends, people who you know, who are expressing themselves and standing up for something, and the more of them that you have, the more likely you are to join them. And Gladwell notes that this pattern is generally applicable, not just in the Freedom Summer, but in all kinds of movements for social change. So he talks about the 4 college students, freshmen, at North Carolina A&T State University in 1960, who became the first 4 students in the country to publicly sit in at a lunch counter to protest segregation. So these are freshmen. So they are 6 or 7 months out of starting their new careers as students. And yet they took this incredibly risky and courageous act. And Gladwell noted the thing that connected them, why did the 4 of them do this, was they knew each other really well. David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil, they lived in the same dorm. 2 of them had gone to high school together. They had spent late nights talking about what it would take to build a movement in their own community. They were inspired by what was happening in Montgomery and elsewhere, but wanted to know what they could do. And finally, they dared themselves, like, are you chicken? Why don't we go sit in at a lunch counter? And it was late night conversations over beer in their dorm room, in which they got the nerve to walk outside the next morning and sit in and demand a cup of coffee. As Gladwell puts the point, Blair worked up the courage the next day to ask for a cup of coffee because he was flanked by his roommate and 2 good friends from high school. And there's another evocative way of pressing the point. So imagine that after this lecture, you walked outside, and across Mass Ave, there were people throwing tear gas, police descending on a group of protesters, sparks flying. It looks dangerous. Would you join the protesters? I see one person nodding. But I think most of us would say, I am getting away from there. Perhaps, you have finals to study for. This is certainly going to be a distraction from turning in your papers. Who knows if the administrative board is watching? You might be interfering with someone's normal activities. It might depend on what are they protesting for. You don't want to leap into the unknown only to find out you're working with the claimant. But now imagine a different setting. So imagine that instead of unknown strangers are out there protesting, your grandmother is out there. Imagine your relatives are out in the streets fighting with armed police officers who are trying to suppress their expression. Imagine your best friend is out there by the cars. Would it really matter to you what they're protesting? If your grandparents were out in the streets, would you really say, I'm sorry, I have to study for finals? I don't think you would. I think you would likely join them. And it speaks to the importance of the relationships you have with the people who are going to be out there with you. Courage comes not just from ourselves, but from other people, and the people who are close to us. And the last thing I think any of us want is to be out-couraged by our grandparents. And for me, this is a problem that I face every day. So my grandparents both come from immigrant backgrounds. My grandmother was the child of Jewish immigrants who came from Minsk to New York City. Started at Delhi, educated her. She went to Hunter College, and in the 1930s decided to join the Red Cross in preparation as the United States prepared to enter World War II. She was a radical. When she was shipped to Hawaii during the war, she noticed that the US Army was segregated and that the USO was only performing for white officers or white members of the military. So she and other dissenting members of the Red Cross decided to help organize a labor canteen, one that was an integrated space for Black and white people in Hawaii to socialize and come together in celebration of themselves and the principles that they were fighting for. At this labor canteen, she met my grandfather, Ewart, who is born in Panama, from Jamaican parents, migrated to Boston when he was little, went to Boston Latin, and actually entered the class of 1932 at Harvard University, or 1933 at Harvard University. So he was the only Black person in his class when he set foot in Cambridge in 1929. And when he arrived at Harvard, once the administrators realized they had accidentally admitted a Black person, they disciplined him. They said, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to live in the dorms because at this time the dorms were segregated. I'm sorry, your financial aid is going to be revoked because you didn't submit a photograph with your application. And though he had gone to high school with people from the area in Boston, he found that in the classroom and on the streets and in the hallways, not one of his white classmates would acknowledge his name. With that sense of social isolation, just being completely by himself, he dropped out and finished his degree at the City College of New York. From there, he joined the labor movement. He got involved with public workers in New York City. He got a master's degree at night, and then during World War II was shipped out to Hawaii in a segregated unit where he met my grandmother, Eugenia. They met in August of 1945. They got married in October of 1945 at a time when interracial marriage was illegal in many states. And when they came back to the mainland, things were no easier for either of them. But what my grandmother said that she loved about my grandfather wasn't the sense that being in a relationship with him would be easy, but because what she found that he stood for was community. His background in the labor movement and his sense that social isolation is killing people. She thought there was little about him that rose from an impulse for personal aggrandizement. Rather, he found his motivation in the desirable goal that communities of citizens, of workers, of Afro-Americans, of all people, work together to improve their lot. And thus, it was characteristic of Ewart to favor solutions that brought individuals together to work in community. And that community proved vital for both of them. After the war, my grandfather became the International Secretary of the United Public Workers of America, a union that at the time had over 100,000 members, black and white. He ran for local office in New York with the American Labor Party. He became the campaign manager for W.E.B. Du Bois when he ran for Senate in New York. Didn't get very many votes, but the votes he got were worth it. And he committed himself to the labor movement. He committed himself to building power among ordinary people because he thought that was going to be the way to bring civil rights to black Americans and all Americans. But when the McCarthy era began, he was blacklisted. He and the rest of the leadership of the United Public Workers were declared communists. They were kicked out of the CIO, the main federation of radical unions at the time. Although he had managed to get a law degree at night, he was banned from practicing law. And so instead of spending the 1950s pursuing his passion in the labor movement as a lawyer, he instead worked in real estate because that was the only job he was allowed to take as someone who was accused of being sympathetic to communism. My grandmother, meanwhile, found that she did not have the support from her family that she expected. For her, her Jewish upbringing was essential to why she thought racial justice was paramount to her life. Acknowledging the suffering of the people in Egypt in the story of Exodus inspired her to acknowledge the suffering that she saw in her own generation. But when her husband and daughters were not allowed to participate in community gatherings, she had to find community elsewhere. And she ultimately found that community in the same kind of labor family that my grandfather still cultivated, even as they were all persecuted by the federal government. She led a boycott of Woolworths in New York City because of its racial segregation in the South. And she joined the March on Washington in 1963. As Harvard Law professor Derek Bell wrote in her obituary, at some point, Jeannie saw the line that separated black from white, superior from inferior, rich from poor, and she crossed the line. The blacklist against my grandfather only ended because of student organizing at Harvard University. So my mom, their daughter, went to Radcliffe. She was in the class of 1971. And as soon as she arrived, she was one of a handful of black students. So there were 36 black students in the class, 6 of them women. And they felt the same sense of social isolation that my grandfather had felt a few decades earlier. But this time, there was not just one, there were 6. And for her, that was enough. She said that with her posse, as she called them, we wanted to express our concern that there were very few black women being admitted to Radcliffe. We sat in the corridor leading up to the dean's office. We were told to be very ladylike. I remember well. This was our ladylike approach. But I think we got their attention. They certainly started admitting more students of color. This kind of informal sit-in in University Hall or in the dean's office at Radcliffe expanded over the next few years. After Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, black students organized their own celebration of his life. And as part of that celebration, the black students joined together in a group that eventually became known as Afro. And they said, for one thing, there is not enough of us here, but for another thing, we do not think that this university is teaching us the things that we came here to learn. We demand a change in who is allowed to teach here. We demand a change in what we are being taught. And so they published an advertisement in the Crimson calling for an endowed chair for a black professor, courses relevant to blacks at Harvard, more black faculty, and more black students. These kind of demands were ignored, but in the late 1960s, students were not just protesting for this, but also protesting the Vietnam War, protesting for women's liberation, protesting for all kinds of things, and using the leverage they had as students to make their demands heard. Students took over University Hall for days. Students led sit-ins, and students led a strike that lasted for multiple days and was voted on in Harvard Stadium. Students walking out of classes and saying, we will not return until all our demands are met. For some of those students, that was an end to the ROTC presence on campus as students were being otherwise drafted into the Vietnam War. But for the members of Afro, it was also the creation of a Black Studies department. They wanted to make Harvard a place where they felt like they belonged. And when Harvard was not doing it on their own, they forced Harvard to listen. Eventually, after this kind of extensive pressing of the university administration, the university faculty agreed to hold office hours with members of Afro in which they expressed their demands. And at a faculty vote, the faculty voted almost 2-to-1 to create an Afro-American Studies department. And the person who they ultimately brought to lead the studies department was my grandfather, the person who had previously dropped out because of the sense of social isolation. What brought him back was not anything that he had done differently, but because a community at Harvard had rallied around him. It took 40 years, but it happened. My mom was one of the students who was organizing. She was a little unhappy that her parents were now moving to Cambridge. She had appreciated the distance between Cambridge and New York City. Her parents just wanted to get lunch with her all the time. But when my grandfather led the Afro-American Studies department, the lesson that he thought students needed to learn was the importance of class solidarity. For him, what would help Afro-American students, as he called them, was understanding that they had power collectively, as part of a collective struggle. And so went the labor movement, so went civil rights, as he understood them. As Bill Fletcher, the education director of the AFL-CIO, said a few years later, or a few years after he died, he taught that black workers historically had played an important, even crucial role in the labor movement, and if we were organized, we could change the way the labor movement operated and change the politics of the African American community at the same time. Student organizing is also why I am here. So 30 years or 20 years after my grandfather was chosen to lead the Afro-American Studies department, Harvard still had not hired a single black woman on faculty at the law school. When the dean at the time spoke about student demands and student protests for more black faculty, more faculty of color, and more female faculty in an era in which of Harvard's 62 tenured professors at the law school, there were 5 women and 3 black men. So of 62 professors, 5 women and 3 black men. The dean said Harvard is dedicated to making the faculty more diverse, but has not been able thus far to find a black woman with the proper qualifications. After students sat in at his office and otherwise protested around campus, he invited 12 visiting faculty members in 1990. One was a black woman, and she was not hired. In the face of comments that the Harvard Law School faculty had looked around in the 1990s and were unable to find a single woman of color who was qualified to teach you, students protested, they organized, they got together, and they had the support of one member of the faculty, Derek Bell. And Derek Bell joined the students by announcing that he would no longer take a salary from Harvard until they acceded to the student demands to hire more women, more faculty of color, and at least one black woman on the faculty. He filed complaints, he taught classes without pay, but otherwise he stood with students as they engaged in civil disobedience to persuade and to force the Harvard administration to listen that they did not believe them when they said it was impossible to find someone qualified to teach them what law and justice should look like. In 1992, after students filed a lawsuit against the law school for hiring only white men, the dean at the time told the Wall Street Journal that he thought they were protesting simply because women and students of color at the law school lacked self-confidence. So the students sat in his office for 24 hours to let him know that they had plenty of self-confidence. They were disciplined by the administrative board, but they did not discontinue their organizing because they knew what was more important than having a record on their transcript that would be sent to bar committees. And that was that they were learning and they were teaching one another what it means to be courageous and what it means to pursue justice. Bell ultimately was fired by Harvard because he refused to work for pay in light of his ongoing strike. But it was as part of this campaign that Barack Obama, as a student, as the then president of the Harvard Law Review, gave his first speech at the law school in support of Derek Bell's and the other students. As part of his speech, Barack Obama said, "How can this man do such great things? Who is this Derek Bell? And why is he so courageous?" And when Bell got up to speak in front of the other students at what's now the Crossroads, he said, "I appreciate that, Barack. That's very nice of you. But it's not me. I know that I am here because of the generations of students before you who had demanded my presence." And so for Bell, his advocacy, his courage was not coming from him, it was coming from the students around him. And so even after he was kicked off the faculty, students continued to organize. And in 1998, Harvard hired my mom as the first woman of color to teach at the law school with tenure. She was not the only person who was qualified to teach, but she was the only one that Harvard was prepared to hire because of student demand. She knew something about what it's like to face this kind of individual sense of isolation. In the early 1990s, she had been nominated by her friend from law school, Bill Clinton, to be the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Once conservative critics targeted her ideas as undemocratic because she believed in proportional representation, the president did not stand by her, but withdrew her nomination. She never got the chance to defend her ideas in front of a Senate hearing. And she knew what it felt like her father before her, to feel the intensity of social isolation, of standing for a principle and not having allies. And so when she arrived at the law school, she was determined to make sure that no one else faced that kind of experience. Within a few years of beginning teaching on the faculty, as students in the college and the law school sat in at University Hall demanding that the richest university on the planet pay its workers a living wage, she defended them when they were disciplined by the administrative board. So one takeaway from all of this is that if Harvard hires a member of my family, we will represent you before the administrative board. But another lesson is that my mom and my grandparents and people like Derek Bell do not have this unusual or unique sense of courage that only comes once in a blue moon. They had relationships. They had close relationships with family, with their loved ones, and with students, because they knew what it felt like to be isolated, standing alone on a principal. And they knew that their courage to do that came from other people's courage to stand with them. To say, I will not be the student in the classroom who sees someone else defend a progressive income tax and remains silent. My mom taught me the importance of building a constituency of accountability, people who will see you through your career, people who you trust and reach out to and tell them that you trust them, and who can tell you, I will stand by you when we are fighting for our principles together, even when it's hard. And that's a lesson that I have tried to bring with me when I joined the faculty. As someone without tenure, I was terrified to do anything that would put me in any kinds of crosshairs. But when student workers went on strike, it was a no-brainer that I would be out there on the picket line with them. When students were leaving class to protest the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh and his continued place on the faculty, I was with those students too. When students campaigned and organized for LIP, I was with them as well. Not because these were my interests, not because I have some sense of courage that no one else does, but because I draw my courage from you. It is seeing students put themselves on the line that makes me feel powerful. It is seeing you all face threats and persecution and a sense of isolation that makes me feel strong. It is your courage that gives me courage. It's also fun. So I brought Cora, who's now 5, to her first strike, and it was an HGSU strike. And to this day, if you ask her, hey Cora, what's disgusting? Union busting. But more recently, I found myself standing with students who are protesting a genocide in Gaza. And that is hard. It is hard to see students go through the threats of ostracism, of losing jobs, of losing where they live, of facing criminal prosecution initiated by the university, of facing discipline for standing up on principle that liberation does not require putting people in an occupied state. Student belief in the equality and dignity of all people, to me, is not a controversial position. And yet, simply putting my name on a letter or writing a letter myself terrifies me every time. It feels scary to put oneself out there. And that fear does not go away. But the only reason I do anything, as modest as it is, and as insignificant as it feels in the face of what you have done yourselves, is because I am inspired by you. When I teach constitutional law, I often think in the abstract of someone like Gordon Hirabayashi or Fred Korematsu, both of whom were in their early 20s, recently graduated as college students, when they protested the exclusion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. They took their cases to the Supreme Court and lost, but they stood on principle as students. And I often think, where does that courage come from? How can I imagine that courage in myself? It feels like they are special, and they deserve, rightfully, their place in history for being unique. But this year, I have not had to imagine what that courage looks like, because I can see it. I mourn for the Israeli families that lost their lives and their loved ones on October 7th. I mourn for the people who remain away and kidnapped from their loved ones. But I also mourn for the tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who I see every day and think of my own children and wonder, who would stand with me if I and my community were facing this intense level of suffering? I am proud that the law school can show empathy for one group of people, and I demand that Harvard show empathy for everyone. And when I see students embracing that same message, when I see students say that liberation does not require targeting another group as the other, it is both intuitive but inspiring, and it gives me the courage to say the same. I've spoken with students who have lost family members, students who have lost their jobs, students who have lost their sense of self-worth, and nevertheless continue to protest and organize for liberation of Palestinians. And in the face of that, the only question I can ask myself is, what more can I do? Of course, there are many people who don't see things this way, who see you and your classmates and think what you are doing is making other students on campus feel unsafe. That arguing for the liberation of Palestinians is inherently anti-Semitic. And I've talked to students who feel this way too. And in conversations, I've asked, why can we not all feel empathy for what is going on? And I've received the response, we have empathy, they don't have empathy. But empathy is not a limited resource like that. And yet, I've seen letters from our former president of the university look at protesters and people who are serving as safety marshals defending their classmates from being doxxed or hazed or otherwise targeted. And the president of our university has suggested they were deserving not of our praise, but our discipline. That using your body to protect your classmates should be criminal. And so as bombs dropped on Gaza and nearly 2 million people have faced famine, I was deeply offended by the sense that my community was not seeing the same thing that I and the students I was talking to could clearly see. I wrote a letter, or joined a letter, that protested the university's position with respect to our own students, defending all of our right to stand and express ourselves and to express our sense of justice. And in response to that letter, got a new website. These terms hurt. It does not feel good to be accused of being anti-Semitic. These are lies. But they are lies with a purpose. And that purpose is to isolate. That purpose is to make us think that arguing for human equality necessarily demands treating Jewish people as inferior. They are lies that are designed to make us not think about what justice requires in our current moment and stand for it because we are worried about how our own futures will be affected by our choices. All of our students deserve to feel equally safe on campus. Our Jewish students, our Muslim students, our Christian students, and students of no faith at all, as well as everyone else. Demanding that is not anti-Semitic at all. And faced with this kind of intimidation, where I have drawn courage is from you, and the people like you, and people like my colleagues, like Marshall Gantz, and others who have faced similar attacks and responded that these kind of lies are not only unacceptable, but are not in keeping at all with his own Jewish tradition. For someone like Gantz, what it means to be Jewish is to stand for the liberation of all people. And when I hear him say that, I think regardless of what attacks I might face, I want to stand with him. And so I have been inspired by you. I have been inspired by members of the Muslim Law Student Association. I've been inspired by members of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, because I see you see the same threats that I see, and yet you are doing something about it. And so I draw my courage from you. So before I close, I want you to look around at the other people in this room. And I want you to imagine that the people in this room are a threat. That you should be afraid of them, that they might put your face on a truck, that they might take away your job. How would you physically respond to that feeling? Do you want to hide? Do you feel weak? Do you feel nervous? I know I would. Now I want you all to stand up. And I want you to put your hand on someone else's shoulder if they're willing. Use two hands if you want. And as you stand with each other together, do you feel strong?
Yes.
Do you feel powerful?
Yes.
Do you feel courageous?
Yes.
Do you feel like you can commit that as you disperse after this year and go off to do the work of establishing justice that brought you here, if you see someone else standing up for justice too, that you will stand with them?
Yes.
I'm glad you feel that way, because I feel that way too. And I promise you, don't stop now. I promise you that if I see you doing the work of justice, even in the face of social isolation, even in the face of attacks, even in the face of persecution, that I will stand with you. It is terrifying to stand alone. But it is the greatest honor to stand with you and learn from you what true courage looks like. Thank you.